cardboard box was lighter than I expected. 3 years of my life, and it fit in something my dad used to pack beer in. I stood in the parking lot of St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, still wearing my scrubs, the box balanced against my hip. It was February. The kind of February that makes you question every decision you've ever made about where to live. The wind off the lake cut right through my jacket, and I remember thinking, I should feel something right now. Grief, or relief, or anger. But I just felt the cold. My phone buzzed. My sister. I stared at the screen until it stopped. She'd been calling since the funeral, not because she wanted to check on me. I knew her well enough to know that. She'd been calling because there were things to sort out. Dad's things, the house in Oakville, the accounts. She had opinions about all of it, my sister. Strong ones, delivered in that particular tone she perfected over 30 years of being the one who stayed close to home. I was the one who left. That's how she framed it, always. I left. As if leaving to train as a nurse, as if moving 40 minutes away to work in a hospital, as if spending the last 18 months on an extended placement up in Thunder Bay because they were desperately short-staffed, as if all of that was some kind of personal insult directed specifically at her. Dad needed people around him, she'd said at the reception after the burial, not even waiting until the guests had cleared out. Real people, present people. I'd been holding a cup of tea that had gone cold. I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that saying anything only gave her more material. You chose your career over your family, she said. You always have. I put the cup down. I hugged my aunt, thanked the neighbors for coming, and I drove back to my apartment in the East End, and I sat on the floor of my hallway for about an hour. Then I went back to work, because people needed nursing whether I was devastated or not. Dad died in November. The will was read in January. I'd taken the train down from Thunder Bay, slept 4 hours in my old bedroom at the house that already felt like it belonged to someone else, and sat in a lawyer's office on Bloor Street while a man in a gray suit explained that my father had left the family home and the bulk of his savings to my sister. To me, he left a storage unit, Unit 114, at a place called Lakeview Self-Storage in Hamilton, paid up through the end of the year, and a key on a plain ring with a square of masking tape on it where he'd written, in his handwriting, "For my girl who knows how to work." My sister smiled when the lawyer said it. Not a kind smile. A storage unit, she said in the car after. Not a question, just a statement delivered like a verdict. Honestly, I'm not surprised. You were never really here, were you? Dad probably didn't know what else to do with you. I didn't answer her. I looked out the window at the January slush on Bloor Street, and I told myself to breathe. She dropped me at Union Station. The train back to Thunder Bay wasn't until the next morning, so I'd booked a room at a cheap hotel near the waterfront. I sat on the bed and looked at the key in my hand and tried to figure out what I was supposed to feel about a father who left his other daughter a storage unit. The thing about my dad, and I know this is hard to explain to people who didn't know him, is that he was not careless. He was quiet. He was private. He thought before he spoke, sometimes for so long that you'd already moved on to something else by the time he answered. He was an electrician who'd run his own small company for 25 years. He kept meticulous records. He was the kind of man who labeled things. For my girl who knows how to work. I fell asleep with the key in my hand. I drove to Hamilton on a Saturday in February after I'd handed off my last shift and packed up my apartment. My placement in Thunder Bay was done. I had a month before my next position started. A permanent one, back in Toronto, at a different hospital than St. Michael's. I had a storage unit in Hamilton and nowhere pressing to be. The drive down the 403 was gray and flat. The radio kept cutting out. I stopped at a Tim Hortons in Stony Creek and sat in the parking lot with a coffee and thought about calling my sister. Then didn't. Lakeview Self-Storage looked like every storage facility I'd ever seen. Corrugated metal, orange roll-up doors, a guy in a small office who buzzed me in without looking up from his phone. Unit 114 was on the ground floor, toward the back. The key turned easily, which surprised me. I'd expected rust. I pushed the door up. It wasn't full of junk. That was the first thing I noticed. No broken furniture, no garbage bags of old clothes, no mystery boxes from 1987. It was organized. Neat even, in the way that my dad did. Everything. A system that wasn't immediately obvious but was definitely there. There were shelves along one wall. On them, file boxes, all labeled. Client records going back 15 years. Ledgers. A locked metal box about the size of a shoebox that had a separate key, smaller than the one I'd used on the door. Against the far wall, stacked carefully, were tools. His tools. The good ones. Not the ones from the garage, but the professional equipment. The meters, the specialized kit, the things he'd bought over decades and maintained carefully because he said good tools were worth protecting. In the center of the unit there was a folding table. On the table there was an envelope, my name on the front and his handwriting. I sat down on an overturned bucket and I held the envelope for probably 5 minutes before I opened it. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten on lined paper from the same notebook he'd kept by the phone in the kitchen my whole life. And folded inside the letter, there was a second, smaller envelope. It had the name of a law firm on it, not the same one that had read the will. A different one, in Hamilton. I read the letter first. He started by apologizing. Not for the storage unit, for not explaining sooner. He wrote that he'd meant to talk to me about all of this in person, that he'd kept thinking he had more time, that the way he'd been wrong about a few things in his life. He wrote that he loved me and that he was proud of me in a way he hadn't said enough. And reading that part, I had to put the letter down and look at the ceiling of the storage unit for a while. Then he got specific. He'd built the storage unit up over the last 3 years. Not the unit itself, but what it contained. The tools were worth serious money. He'd looked it up. The set together, specialty electrical equipment for commercial work, some of it hard to source. He'd also, and this was the part that made me read the sentence 3 times, been running a small side business out of his retirement, consulting on electrical safety inspections for small commercial properties, nothing registered anywhere. Cash work for people who'd known him for years. Steady income, quietly saved. The locked metal box, he wrote, contained documentation of all of it, and in the small envelope from the Hamilton law firm, there was a letter confirming that he'd set up a registered account in my name 18 months earlier, with a sum that he listed at the bottom of the page. I read it once, and then I read it again, and I sat on that bucket in a storage unit in Hamilton in February, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since November. It wasn't the money, exactly. It wasn't even the tools. It was the line he'd written just before he listed the amount. Your sister will be comfortable. I need you to be free. He'd known. He'd understood something about both of us that he'd never said out loud, that my sister needed security in the form of things she could see and live inside of, and that I needed something different. Room. Options. The ability to make choices without a financial wall closing in. He'd been thinking about this. He'd been planning it. Quietly, the way he did everything. I called the Hamilton law firm on Monday morning. The letter was legitimate. The account was real. There were a few forms to sign, a meeting to attend, a process that would take a few weeks. The lawyer, a woman with a no-nonsense manner that I liked immediately, had met my dad twice. She said he'd been very clear about his intentions and very organized. He said you'd be surprised, she told me. He hoped you wouldn't be upset that he didn't tell you sooner. I wasn't upset. I didn't have room left for upset. My sister called that evening. I'd been expecting it. I think she'd spoken to the first lawyer, the one who'd read the will, who had apparently let slip that there might be additional assets still being processed. She opened with pleasantries, which was unusual enough that I knew immediately she wanted something. I've been thinking, she said, about Dad's situation, everything he left behind. I think there might have been some mistakes in how things were divided. I let her talk. She had a way of building a case, starting with general grievances and moving toward a specific point, layering justifications the way a prosecutor might. She talked about everything she'd done over the years, the drives to his appointments, the dinners she'd organized, the way she'd managed his affairs when he had that scare with his heart 2 years ago, managed them while I was up north with my phone barely getting a signal. She wasn't wrong about any of that. She had done those things. I just feel, she said, finally arriving at her point, that whatever else he might have had set aside, tools or savings or whatever, it should probably be divided equally. That would be fair. I thought about the letter on lined paper, the tools lined up carefully against the wall, the masking tape with my name in his handwriting. For my girl who knows how to work. He left you the house, I said, which comes with a mortgage and maintenance costs. He left you the house, I said again. And his savings. And the furniture and the car and everything in it. He thought about this. He made his choices. She went quiet. I was there for him, she said. You weren't. And there it was. The thing she'd been carrying since November, maybe longer. The central argument of her life for the past few years, the thing she held up every time she needed to establish that she was owed something I wasn't. I know, I said, and I'm grateful for that. Genuinely. You were there in ways I couldn't be. But he saw that too, and he made his choices. He made them for his own reasons, and I think we both have to respect that. You're being selfish, I'm being honest. She hung up. I stood in my hotel room. I was staying at a place near the Hamilton waterfront while I sorted things out, and I looked out at the gray water and I let myself feel the full weight of it. The grief and the guilt and the anger and the love all tangled together, the way they always are in families. Impossible to separate cleanly. I thought about calling her back. About offering something, some gesture, some way of making the ending softer. There was a part of me that wanted to fix it the way I always had, to smooth the tension and absorb the discomfort and make everyone feel better even when it cost me. But I was tired. I was so tired of being the one who paid that particular cost. I didn't call her back that night. The forms took 3 weeks to process. In that time, I found a small apartment in the Bloor West neighborhood of Toronto, close to the hospital where I'd be starting in the spring. I went back to Hamilton twice more to sort through the storage unit, cataloging the tools, going through the file boxes, slowly understanding the shape of what my dad had built and why he'd built it the way he had. I found a photograph tucked inside one of the ledgers. The two of us, me maybe 10 years old, in his work van. He was teaching me how to read a voltage meter. I'm concentrating so hard in the picture that my tongue is sticking out a little. He's looking at me instead of the meter, and he's smiling in the quiet way he had. I kept the photograph. I listed the tools with a commercial electrical supplier who dealt in used professional equipment. They sold in less than 2 weeks. I kept one set, his favorite multimeter, the one he'd had since before I was born. Because some things aren't for selling. I signed the account paperwork at the Hamilton law firm on a Tuesday morning. The lawyer walked me through everything efficiently and kindly, and when we were done, she shook my hand and said my dad had been a good man. He talked about your work, she said. When he came in, he was proud of you. I held that on the train back to Toronto. Proud of you. The words he'd never quite managed to say directly, filtered through a stranger in an office, arriving late but arriving. My sister and I didn't speak for 2 months. Then she called on a Sunday afternoon and her voice sounded different. Flatter, more tired, the sharp edges worn down a little. She said she'd been doing some thinking, that she'd spoken to her husband about everything, and that he'd told her some things she didn't want to hear, but probably needed to. I said some things that weren't fair, she said. At the funeral. After. For a long time, probably. I didn't rush to reassure her. I used to do that, jump in immediately with "it's okay" or "don't worry about it," papering over everything quickly so we could all move on. I just listened. I was angry, she said, and jealous, I think, that you could just go, that you had this whole life that wasn't about being here. I didn't know how to stop resenting that. I know, I said. I'm sorry. We talked for almost an hour. About Dad, about the house she was keeping, about my new apartment and the hospital and what it was like to start somewhere new. About small things too, a show she'd been watching, a restaurant she wanted to try, the kind of ordinary conversation that only becomes possible after something hard has been said. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. We're not that kind of family, and maybe no family really is. But we found, somewhere in that hour, a small beginning. I started at the new hospital in March. Different building, different floor, different team. But the same work, and the work was the thing I'd always understood best. Patients don't care about your family drama. They need you present, paying attention, steady. I could do that. I'd always been able to do that. I hung the photograph on the wall of my new apartment. Him teaching me to read the meter, me concentrating hard, his quiet smile. Some inheritances aren't obvious at first. Some of them come in plain envelopes, or in the specific way a person looked at you when they thought you weren't paying attention, or in a set of tools lined up carefully against a wall with the intention that you would find them exactly when you needed to. My dad knew which daughter needed what. He wasn't a sentimental man, but he was a precise one, and there's a kind of love in that too, the kind that plans ahead, that labels things, that writes 4 pages on lined paper because it couldn't quite manage to say it out loud. I think about that sometimes, at the end of a long shift, on the train home. The masking tape with my name on it, the tools stacked neatly, the envelope waiting on a folding table in a storage unit in Hamilton, patient, as he always was, waiting for me to find my way there. He knew I would. I keep coming back to the label on that key. A square of masking tape, 3 words in my dad's handwriting. He didn't write, "I love you." He wasn't built for that. He wrote something more specific, and I think that's what made it land so hard. He saw something in me that I'd stopped being sure anyone noticed. The thing about doing the right thing quietly is that it doesn't always look like anything from the outside. 3 years working short-staffed shifts in Thunder Bay, driving back to Toronto twice when I could, sending money when my sister said the utilities were behind. None of that was visible. None of it showed up in the final accounting the way presence does, the way being in the room does, and for a long time I accepted that. I told myself that doing good work was enough, that it didn't need to be witnessed. But I'd be lying if I said my sister's words didn't get in. They did. You chose your career over your family. I turned that sentence over for months. I asked myself if she was right. Not because I believed her exactly, but because doubt is easier to carry when someone says the thing you're already afraid of. What I've come to understand, slowly, not all at once, is that there's a difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt is what other people hand you. Responsibility is what you actually carry. My dad understood that distinction better than anyone I've known. He didn't make his choices out of sentiment. He made them out of clarity. He looked at both his daughters and he thought carefully about what each of us actually needed. Not what would be easiest to divide, not what would look fair from the outside. That takes a kind of clear-eyed thinking that most of us struggle with, even in small decisions. I think about the tools lined up against that wall, the ledgers in their labeled boxes. He'd been building that for 3 years, quietly, without telling me, without asking for credit. That's the version of integrity I want to grow into. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that just keeps doing the work because the work matters. The hard part was my sister. Still is, some days. It would have been easy to use what I found to make her feel small, to lay out every document and every dollar as proof that I was right and she was wrong. I didn't want to do that, partly because it wouldn't have helped anything, but mostly because I don't think that's who I want to be. She'd carried real weight over those years. She'd been there in ways I genuinely couldn't. Her resentment didn't come from nowhere. Understanding that didn't mean agreeing with her, but it meant I could have an honest conversation instead of a winning argument. What I've learned, if I'm being straight about it, is that you don't get to choose whether life tests you. You only get to choose how much of yourself you bring to the test. Whether you show up with honesty, even when it costs you. Whether you keep going when the work is invisible and the recognition isn't coming. Whether you're decent to someone even after they've been unkind to you. My dad left me a storage unit in Hamilton. What was inside it changed things practically, yes, but what I carry with me every day is something else. The quiet knowledge that someone who loved me had watched carefully, thought clearly, and trusted me to find my way there. That's the inheritance that actually matters.